Well, welcome folks here in the sanctuary. Welcome folks with us online. We finished in actually shorter than I would have thought. Our previous look when we were flew out of my head what we just finished talking about when we were talking about Esther, and so it didn't. I thought we would spend some time on three other personalities in the Old Testament, and I want to talk about Ruth tonight. But to get to the story of Ruth and what really are some of the cultural and biblical underpinnings of the story that might seem odd to us, I want to talk about a few other scriptures first, because the story is kind of a little romance novel kind of story, a little short romance story about Ruth and Boaz, but it also is a story about what happens in this culture to women who have no protectors, women who are widowed, especially a young widow. What is the fate of a young widow? And specifically here, what is the fate of a young widow who is not a native of Israel, who is a foreigner? And what does this say about Israel's reaction to foreigners? What does it say about women? What does it say about all kinds of things? And so let me start by reading a few things that are part of Jewish law, Old Testament law. Real quick, in Deuteronomy 25, and you can turn there if you want. Deuteronomy 25 has this about what happens when a young couple is married and the husband dies without producing an heir or a child. What happens to that young widow? Because this is a culture where women don't, go out and find jobs. This is a different kind of culture. And so look at Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10. Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10. And this falls in a list of just a lot of laws that were part of Old Testament rules that, the books of Deuteronomy has a lot of rules and laws, and some of them are more cultural, and some of them are more religious, and some of them are more practical. But here's 25 of Deuteronomy, starting at verse 5. If brothers are living together, and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her, and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. So, get that. Young couple, husband dies without producing a son. It is the responsibility of the young man's brother to then marry that widow, and the first son born to that relationship is given the name of the dead brother, and then he inherits that portion of the household. In other words, let's say there was three brothers, and this one dies, and this brother marries the widow, and they have a son. Well, that son ends up being the heir of that third of the family estate, or whatever you would call it. Now, sometimes the eldest son got a larger portion, but without getting into some of those details, this is the way that the dead son who died without producing a son of his own, that his name is not, as they say, blotted out. His name does not vanish. He still has a heritage. He still has a family line made possible by his brother marrying his widow. Now it goes on in verse 7. However, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, She shall go to the elders at the town gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to carry on his brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duty of her brother-in-law to me. Then the elders of his town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, I do not want to marry her, his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, this is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. That man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled. Okay. So to refuse to take on this duty is shameful. And his sister-in-law is told, if your brother-in-law will not marry you and take you as one of his wives, because you might say, well, what if he already has a wife? Well, he has to take another wife. You know, he has to take her on as a second wife or a third wife or whatever. If that brother-in-law will not take on his dead brother's widow and sleep with her and have a son by her that will then inherit his dead brother's portion of the family goods, land, property, whatever, she shall spit in his face, and he then has a name of shame associated with him. This is a law of how do you protect a young widow, and how do you make sure that a man's line does not vanish? Now, you say protect a young widow. What could a young widow do if her brother-in-law doesn't do this for her? What's her recourse? Well, you might say, well, do her parents take some responsibility for her? Probably not. For often the only way a young widow could survive was prostitution. The only job that she could, she can't go start a business in this culture. She can't just go find a job in this culture. So this is why this is such a strict rule. Now, you say, this is going to come into play in the story of Ruth. Okay. Now, let me give you an example of this same rule playing out in another family and see how it plays out. Before we actually look at Ruth, let me show you how this plays out in another situation. Go back to Genesis 38. Genesis 38. Because it's interesting. Genesis is primarily, after we get through the first 11 chapters of these stories that are sort of impossible to date. They're sort of what we often call prehistory. The Adam and Eve, Eden stories, the Tower of Babel, the Noah's Ark stories, those all occur in a time that is not dateable. And, different people debate are these stories more parables than they are history, etc. But then you get to chapter 12 of 11, and we start with the story of Abraham. We have the story of Abraham, we have the story of Isaac, we have the story of Jacob's 12 sons. Then we have the Joseph saga, and Joseph gets sold by his brothers into slavery in Egypt in chapter 37. And then we have a one-chapter break before we return to the story of Joseph. Joseph's story then resumes in chapter 39. So the story of Joseph is in chapter 37, it's in chapter 39. But chapter 38, we have another story about one of Joseph's older brothers, his brother Judah, which is of the 12 sons of Jacob. In other words, the 12 sons of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel. Judah becomes the most prominent. The southern kingdom takes the name Judea after him. So here's a story about Judah in Genesis 38. And it's a story that I would rarely preach on a Sunday morning with children in the pews. And as you read the story, you'll see why I would rarely preach on this. And most pastors would rarely preach on this story of Genesis 38. At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. There Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and lay with her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. So, Judah, one of the 12 sons of Israel, marries a Canaanite woman, which right off the bat, like, you're not really supposed to marry outside of Israel. Marries a Canaanite woman and has 3 sons by her. These are the 3 sons he has. Judah has 3 sons. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. We're not told why he was wicked or what made him wicked. We're not told how he died. But the firstborn son of Judah is a wicked man, and he dies. And they attribute this to God's judgment. Okay? So, Judah said to Onan, his second-born son, "Lie with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to produce offspring for your brother." This is fulfilling this law we just talked about. Now, you might say, well, the law in Deuteronomy didn't even come until much after the stories of Genesis. Well, the rabbi is not particularly concerned with that. This is considered to be a custom and a rule that is ancient. This idea is sometimes called Levirate marriage. It has nothing to do with being a Levite. It's Levirate marriage, which is you have to marry, if your brother dies and his widow doesn't have any children, you have the responsibility to marry her and produce a child for her. So, Judah's eldest son, dies. Tamar is now a young widow. So, Judah says to his second-born son, Onan, you got to marry Tamar and produce a son for your older brother. Judah said, verse 8, Judah said to Onan, "Lie with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to produce offspring for your brother." But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. In other words, if he has a son, they would have to name the son and that son would then inherit Er's share of the family property. It would be considered, even though he would provide the sperm, the son would be considered his brother's son. Okay? So, which he doesn't want to do. Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so whenever he lay with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from producing offspring for his brother. You see why I don't really preach on this. Because, what does that mean, Mommy? He spilled his seed on the ground. So he did not want to get her pregnant and produce a son that would not be his. Now, again, really side note, because there's no kids here. Hundreds of years later, Christians talked about the sin of onanism, named after Onan. The sin of onanism was a very old term for masturbation. In other words, spilling your seed other than in your wife. Okay? term onanism is not very popular anymore. But, so, Onan will not impregnate his brother's wife. So what he did, verse 10, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so he put him to death. Okay, so, 2 sons have married Tamar. They've both died without producing a son. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law, Tamar, "Live as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up." In other words, the third son, is too young to be married to her, to produce an heir. We're not told how old he is, but we're to assume he's not old enough to fulfill this responsibility. So he says, you go wait until he's old enough to marry you, and then you can marry my third son, and he can fulfill the duty of producing the heir. Live as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up, for he thought he might die too, just like his brothers. It's like he's thinking, she's the black widow here. She's, marry her and you die. So he's kind of afraid to give his third son to Tamar. So is he making an excuse that the son is too young? Because he's thinking, I don't know. She's married 2 of my sons and both of them have died. Now, the Bible says they died because they were wicked, not because of Tamar. But he's thinking, I don't know about marrying this third son. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. So now Judah's wife has died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hirah, the Adulamite, met with him. So the third son is now old enough to fulfill his duty, but Judah has not given the third son to Tamar. It's become apparent now he's not going to give his third son to Tamar. And now Judah, who is now himself a widower, is going up to a sheep shearing. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes. So for years, she's been dressed like a widow, ever since the 2 brothers have died. So she's worn widow's clothes for years. Took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. She says, I'm never going to get the third son. He's grown up, but Judah hasn't given him to me. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she'd covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, come now, let me sleep with you. And what will you give me to sleep with you? She asked. I'll send you a young goat from my flock, he said. Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it? She asked. He said, what pledge should I give you? Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand, she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend, the Adulamite, in order to get his pledge back from the woman, but he didn't find her. He asked the men who lived there, where's the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim? Shrine prostitute, in other words, a pagan religion for whom prostitution was an act of worship. Remember, many of the other fertility gods, how did you worship the fertility god? By sleeping with the prostitute is how you worshipped the fertility god or goddess. Where's the shrine prostitute who was beside the road? There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here, they said. So we went back to Judah and said, I didn't find her. Besides, the men who live there said, there hasn't been any shrine prostitute here. Then Judah said, let her keep what she has, or we'll become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her the young goat, but you didn't find her. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution. As a result, she is now pregnant. Judah said, bring her out and have her burned to death. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. I am pregnant by the man who owns these, she said. And she added, see if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her my son Shelah, and he didn't sleep with her again. Now, find this story kind of icky? So, of course, we also see the great difference between how men's actions are perceived and how women's actions are perceived. He sleeps with a pagan prostitute and thinks absolutely nothing of it. She, his widowed daughter-in-law, who's been in widow's clothes for years, puts on different clothing, and when they find out she's pregnant, the reaction is, kill her for being a loose woman. So the difference in how women are judged and how men are judged is pretty obvious there. A man going to the prostitute is no big deal. An unmarried woman turning up pregnant is worthy of death. So he's going to burn his daughter-in-law to death until she says, "Oh, well, I'm pregnant by the man who gave me this stuff, which is you." And his response is, "She is more righteous than I." It's like, yeah, I'd say so. I'd say she is more righteous than you, Judah. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand, so the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it onto his wrist and said, "This one came out first." But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, "So this is how you have broken out." He was named Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was given the name Zerah. Perez means breaking out. Zerah means scarlet. So, and then we go back to the story of Joseph. But this is a story of Judah, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, of Israel, who then lends his name to the tribe of Judah, which of course is the royal tribe. It is the tribe of which David is from the tribe of Judah, which means, of course, that Jesus is from the tribe of Judah as well. And so we're going to, this we find out Tamar is in Jesus' genealogy. So I bring you that rather unsavory story to show you how this whole idea of you gotta marry the young widow worked. This is how the whole you gotta marry the young widow worked, which is the basis of the Ruth story. Because Ruth is a young widow, and what are we going to do about this young widow? And how is she going to be taken care of? So having said all that, let's go to the story of Ruth. So Ruth is right after Nehemiah. It's before Job. And it's not a very long story. It's only 4, no. Wait a minute. I'm on the wrong page already. No, I'm in the wrong story. I turned back to Esther just from last week. Let me make sure I'm in the right story. I got to turn to the right page. Oh, that's why. My bookmark was still left from last week. Okay. Ruth, right after Judges. Okay. So here we are, Ruth. And here's how the story begins, the story of Ruth. In the days when the judges ruled, well, when is that? That is, the first judge is Joshua. And we have the book of Judges that has people I'm going to talk about next couple of weeks. Gideon, Samson, Deborah, etc. All the way through Samuel is the last judge right before we have the first king, which is Saul, a Benjamite, who is succeeded by David of the tribe of Judah. So the first king is Saul, he's a lousy king. Then David becomes king, and the line of David continues. So this is during the time of the judges. It doesn't say during which judge. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem, that's going to be important, a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The Moabites are one, when you hear about all the different Canaanites, the Hivites and the Perizzites, not parasites, Perizzites and Philistines, etc. And Moabites are one of the other peoples who lived in Canaan. So there's famine in, there's famine in Judah. And so this man by the name of Elimelech, this man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephraimites from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there. Now remember, everybody's name means something. When in the scriptures, names always mean something. Elimelech, name literally means God is king. Eli in Hebrew, Eli always means God, like Elijah, Yah for Yahweh, Elijah, Yahweh is God. That's what Elijah's name means. Elimelech, I think I may have told you when we were studying Esther, the Hebrew word Malek means king. So Elimelech means God is king. So that's what his name means, God is king. Elimelech, he is married to Naomi. The name Naomi means pleasant. Okay? So Elimelech, whose name means God is king, is married to Naomi, whose name means pleasant. And they have 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Their names are not quite as good. Mahlon means sickly, and Chilion means frail. Okay? So they have 2 sons, fragile and sickly. Which, talk about foreshadowing. Like, if you have 2 sons named sickly and frail, that's probably not a good thing. It's probably not a good sign. And if that has to do with them as babies, has to do with, that's what their names mean in Hebrew. So they have 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, sickly and frail. They went to Moab to escape famine, and while they're there, it says Elimelech, verse 3, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with just her 2 sons, with frail and sickly. They married Moabite women. One was named Orpah, and the other Ruth. Bit of trivia. Oprah Winfrey's mother thought she was naming her Orpah after this woman, but she flipped 2 of the letters. So Oprah Winfrey was actually named after Orpah here in the story, but her mother misspelled it. That's where Oprah Winfrey's name came from. There's a little bit of trivia you can learn every day, right? So, so they marry these two Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. After they'd lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion died. Well, big surprise that frail and sickly died. And Naomi was left without her two sons and her husband. So, what started as, there's a man and wife with two sons and two daughters-in-law, now all the men are dead. You got Naomi and two daughters-in-law. That's what's left there in Moab. When she being Naomi, verse 6, when she heard in Moab that Yahweh, the Lord, had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, in other words, the famine back in Judah is over, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown to your dad and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." So there's two Moabite girls, Moabite women, who are now Moabite widows. Naomi, is going to go back to Judah, and she says, you need to go back you need to stay in Moab. You need to go find Moabite husbands. Go back to your parents' house and find Moabite husbands. She kissed them, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We'll go back with you to your people." In other words, we'll go to Judah. But Naomi said, No. Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who would become your husbands? In other words, the next son marries the widow. Well, I'm too old. I'm not going to have any more sons for you to marry. I'm out of sons. They're both gone. So I'm not going to produce any more sons to fulfill that obligation. So you need to go back home to your own country. Return home, my daughters. I'm too old to have another husband. Even I thought there was still hope for me. Even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait for them to grow up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It's bitter for me. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me. So, even if I found a husband today, even if he got me pregnant by some miracle, you're not going to wait for that baby to grow up and marry you. You need to go back to Moab. At this they wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods." Because in Moab is not the land of Yahweh. Moab is not the land of the Lord. "Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." This is probably the most famous passage from Ruth. It's often used in a wedding. I'm not sure if always the people in a wedding realize its original context is a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, but this is the passage that's probably the most well-known passage. Where you go, I will go, and all that. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, because they'd been gone at least 10 years. Or Naomi had been gone at least 10 years. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" In other words, the one that's called pleasant. "Don't call me Naomi," she said. "Call me Mara," which means bitter. Bitter. And sad to say, the name Mary is a version of that. It means bitter. "Don't call me Naomi," she said. "Call me Mara. because the Almighty, which is the word in Hebrew, Shaddai. Sometimes you hear God's name being El Shaddai. That's the word that's translated Almighty there is the Hebrew word Shaddai. Because Shaddai has made my life very bitter. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. Shaddai has brought misfortune upon me. So she is bitter, says, I should change my name from Naomi to bitter, to Mara. So Naomi returned from the Moab, accompanied by Ruth, the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. The barley harvest is usually around the same time as Passover. That's when the barley harvest usually happens. And usually, with the Jewish holidays, there's usually some sort of agricultural meaning along with the religious meaning. The barley harvest usually accompanied Passover. 7 weeks later, at Pentecost, was usually the wheat harvest, etc. There's usually some, by the time you get to the festival of booths, Shavuot, it's usually the first fruits festival. So there's usually an agricultural component to Jewish holidays. So it must be around Passover time because the barley harvest is beginning. Now, chapter 2. Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing whose name was Boaz. This man is a relative of her husband, of Elimelech. We're not told exactly. He's not a brother, but he's a relative. He's maybe a nephew, cousin, we're not sure exactly. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone whose eyes I find favor. All right, what's she talking about there? Go back to Leviticus 23. Leviticus 23 for a minute. How did the laws of Moses, what about poor people? There is nothing in Leviticus about welfare, food stamps, anything like that. But there is something that is meant to be able for poor people to eat. Leviticus 23, verse 22. Leviticus 23:22. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and the alien. I am Yahweh your God. So, when you're harvesting your grain, you leave some behind on the edges. In another place in the law of Moses, it says you don't go through twice. So anything that you miss is left for the poor. So poor people would often go to a field during harvest time, and they would get to follow behind the actual harvesters. And anything that the harvesters missed, the poor people could take. The poor or the foreigner could take it's often called the gleanings. The gleanings. Okay, so Ruth says, to her mother-in-law, Naomi, we don't have any food. We don't have any way to make money. We're destitute. Let me go glean behind people harvesting the barley. I need to go do gleaning behind the harvesters. So that's what she's going to go do. Let me go, verse 2:2, go to the fields, pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, in other words, one of those coincidences that maybe is not a coincidence at all, kind of like this in Esther. As it turned out, she found herself working in the field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. So it makes it sound like she didn't realize she just found a field where there was harvesting happening. She didn't realize she had actually gone to a relative of her father-in-law's field. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they called back. Boaz asked the foreman of his harvesters, "Whose young woman is that? Who is that young woman gleaning behind my pickers, my people who are harvesting? Who is that young woman?" The foreman said, "Well, she's the Moabitess who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She went into the field and has worked steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz goes to Ruth. "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the girls. I've told the men not to touch you. And whenever you're thirsty, you can go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." So he says, you can stick here as long as we're harvesting. Just stay in my field. Follow behind the women that I have harvesting for me. And I'm going to tell the men not to rape you, which apparently was a common thing. I'm going to tell the men to leave you alone and not molest you. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She exclaimed, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Because she is a Moabitess. Boaz explained, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband." So it's like, I've heard your story. "How you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you didn't know before. May Yahweh repay you for what you've done. May you be richly rewarded by Yahweh, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." So he's like, I've heard your story. I know you've come here with Naomi. I know you've left your people, your own religion, your gods, your home, everything, your family, and come to live here. And he's saying, may our God, Yahweh, the Lord, bless you. Put his wings over you, which is just a poetic way of saying protect you. So, and she responds, verse 13, "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord?" She said, "You have given me comfort, and you've spoken kindly to your servant, though I don't have the standing of one of your servant girls. I'm just a gleaner." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread, dip it in the wine vinegar." In other words, you can have some of the food that I'm feeding my workers. Go ahead and eat some of the food that I feed my workers. When she sat down with the harvester, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. "Even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up. And don't rebuke her." In other words, kind of intentionally drop some for her to get. Do it. Leave some extra on the ground for her. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening, and she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted up to about an ephah, which is an incredibly large amount. That's about 22 liters. In a day, this may be what we would call a Middle Eastern exaggeration, but that's a lot of grain in it for a day, 22 liters of grain, to have gathered and threshed and etc. But she had a lot. She had a lot. She carried it back to town. Her mother-in-law saw how much she'd gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what had left over after she had eaten enough. In other words, the meal that he said, "Go ahead and have some of the meal." She brought the leftovers from that too to Naomi. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." And Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He hasn't stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." That man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers. So this idea of marrying the widow extends beyond even the brothers. It's the idea of, a cousin. I mean, you're part of the clan, part of the extended family, that responsibility for somebody to marry this young widow is out there. So she's like, "Oh, this guy, he's part of our clan. He's part of our larger family." Ruth the Moabitess said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with his girls, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." In other words, accosted, attacked. So Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished. So remember, the wheat harvest, as I said, is about 7 weeks after the barley harvest. So she's doing this for at least 7 weeks, because the barley harvest went with Passover, and the wheat harvest went with Pentecost. So this goes on for quite a few weeks. So, chapter 3. One day, Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you where you will be well provided for? Is not Boaz, with whose servant girls you have been, a kinsman of ours? Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash and perfume yourself. Put on your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you're there until he's finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he's lying, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he'll tell you what to do." What do you think is happening right there? What is she telling her to do? It's a pretty bold move, isn't it? Especially the Hebrew word that's translated feet, actually in Hebrew means everything from the toes up to the thigh. Also, something I learned in seminary that I was like, really? A Hebrew euphemism, feet are often a euphemism for genitals, which is, we see this in the David story. Remember the David story, sidetrack. The David story, David's darkest hour, of course. David sleeps with Bathsheba, right? Thinks nothing of it. She turns up pregnant, and David has to cover up the pregnancy by trying to get her husband killed in battle. You remember that story? And so David calls Bathsheba's husband back from the battle. "Well, how's the battle going? How's it, And he says to him, "Well, while you're here, go home and wash your feet." He didn't want him to go home and wash his feet. He wanted to go home and sleep with Bathsheba to cover up the pregnancy so that he would think the child was his and not David's. So, wash your feet in Hebrew was a euphemism for sex. What's going on here with Ruth and Boaz? I don't think she's telling her to go that far. I think she's telling her kind of to snuggle up or get close, because she says after he's been eating and drinking, so he's been drinking, it's the end of the harvest, it's a party, and he's laying down. She says, go and just kind of lay next to him and get kind of under his robe. And so, verse 5, I'll do whatever you say, Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, In other words, he'd drunk a bit. He went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man, and he turned and discovered a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer." So this is her basically saying, will you fulfill this responsibility of the family to take the young widow as your wife and produce a child for my dead husband? "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You've not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am near of kin, there is a kinsman redeemer nearer than I. In terms of how close a relative to her dead father-in-law, he says, I'm not the closest relative, since, I'm the next closest. There's somebody in the family clan closer than me. So stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem, good. Let him redeem. But if he's not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I'll do it. Lie here until morning. So he basically said, yes, if the other guy doesn't want you, I will. So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. He also said, bring me the shawl you are wearing and hold it out. When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then he went back to town. So in other words, gives her more grain to take back to Naomi. Then she told her, when Ruth got to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, how'd it go, my daughter? She told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, he gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Now, again, just in the story, remember what did Naomi say? She said, I left here full and I came back empty. I came back empty. So this same word here now, he says, don't go back to her empty-handed. Don't go back to her empty. There's this, the theme of empty and full is through the story. The theme of empty versus full. Bitter versus pleasant. Etc. So these themes are in this short story, I guess you'd say. And Naomi said, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. In other words, he's going to go find the other kinsman. And my Bible calls it kinsman redeemer, which is kind of an awkward phrase. I mean, it's descriptive. Does anybody have a different phrase for what they're calling these men other than kinsman redeemer? Huh? Go ahead. Guardian redeemer. Yeah. That idea of redemption, when we use the word redeemer in our language, we use it different ways. We use it, you redeem a coupon, things like that, or a lottery ticket or something, I guess. And then we call Jesus our Redeemer. I know that my Redeemer lives. He redeems us, rescues us, saves us from the power of sin and death. We talk about Jesus as a Redeemer. So that word redeem, but in this case, a kinsman redeemer is fulfilling this responsibility of taking care of the young widow within the family, within the clan. So, meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat there. When the kinsman redeemer he had mentioned came along, Boaz said, come over here, my friend, and sit down. So he went over and sat down. In other words, we need to conduct business. And he's there at the city gate, at the town gate. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, sit here, and they did so. Okay, these are the witnesses, because they're going to conduct business now. They're going to conduct a negotiation, and you got to have witnesses to the negotiation that they're going to have. So he gets 10 elders to come and sit also at the city gate to witness the conversation he's going to have, so that there will be witnesses who can say, yes, he said this, and he agreed to this, and they did this transaction. So he went and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, sit here, and they did so. Then he said to the kinsman redeemer, Naomi, who's come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our brother Elimelech. Now, brother there doesn't mean literally brother, like our brother as in, come here, my brother. I mean, that doesn't mean that they were literal brothers, okay? I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will not redeem it, do so. If you will redeem it, do so. If you will not, tell me, so I will know, for no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line. I will redeem it, he said. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the land from Naomi and from Ruth the Moabitess, you acquire the dead man's widow in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. There's this little note in my Bible that kind of explains what I've started to say here. Okay, it says it maybe better than I can and more concisely. In order to marry Ruth, Boaz had to go through a complicated legal procedure at the town gate, a public gathering place. The laws were designed to keep property in the family and to protect family members who might have suffered financial or other setbacks. As a distant relative, Boaz could purchase or redeem Naomi's family property, but only after a closer relative, the kinsman redeemer, had declined. Along with the property, Boaz acquired marriage rights to Ruth, Naomi's relative. And as we said, and then this other fellow knows, okay, and if you have a son by her, it will not really be yours, it will be of this other line. If you produce a son with Ruth, that son will now be the new Elimelech and will get that piece of the clan's property. So he says, okay, but if you do this, just understand the implications. Verse 6, at this the kinsman redeemer said, then I can't redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. Like, it's not really a good deal for me. You redeem it yourself. I can't do it. So this other fellow says, I'm not going to do that because it entangles my stuff with a son that won't even be considered my son, and no, I'm not going to do it. Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. This is slightly different from what we read earlier about spitting in the face and taking off the sandal and saying, you shall be known as the one without a sandal, or the sandal-less or whatever. So, but this sandal coming into play in a legal transaction apparently goes through some various permutations along the line. But, okay, so the kinsman redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself, and he removed his sandal. So this is like, we would shake hands or sign something, but here's my shoe. I mean, that, again, the way that, we think, well, of course you would shake hands, or of course you would sign something, or whatever. And they would go, well, of course you hand him your sandal. Of course, what else would you do? I mean, that makes sense. Hand him your sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders, this is the 10 guys that he'd said, I want you as witnesses. Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I've also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from the town records. Today you are witnesses. Just so all the witnesses understand exactly what this transaction entails, because there is Elimelech, when he left 10 years earlier, had left a piece of property in a famine. This piece of property was not growing anything. He wasn't able to grow anything on this piece of land because of the famine. But it still is legally Elimelech's land. So he's acquiring that from Naomi and, taking Ruth as part of the deal. And the elders and all those at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah." Remember who Rachel and Leah are? They're two of the wives, remember, of Jacob. Remember, Jacob marries two sisters. He marries Leah first, and then he marries her sister Rachel, and Rachel is the one that he really loves the most. His uncle tricks him into marrying the one he doesn't love first. He marries Leah first, then he marries Rachel, and then they get into a contest of who can produce the most babies, and then they each have their maids be surrogates, and between the 4 women they produce the 12 sons, if you remember that whole story of Jacob. So they're saying, be fruitful like Leah and Rachel. Leah may have been the one that was not loved, but she produced 6 of the sons. Leah produced 6 of the sons. Rachel produced just 2, but they were Jacob's favorites, Joseph and Benjamin. That's why Jacob favored Joseph and Benjamin so much and gave Joseph the coat of many colors, and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, the blessing is, may you be fruitful like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. Between Rachel and Leah, they produced 8 of the 12 sons of Jacob, and the other 4 were produced by the 2 maids. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. But you remember how Perez was born to Tamar? Impregnated by her father-in-law. But that's who that is. May they be famous like him. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. He went to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age." Okay, in other words, your grandson will be your ability to survive, your ability to not be a penniless widow. This marriage will provide for you, Naomi, for your daughter-in-law who loves you and who's better to you than 7 sons has given him birth. In other words, this daughter-in-law of yours, this Ruth, she's better than 7 sons. She's more faithful, more worthy, and now has brought you, has married now a wealthy man, and, you're going to be okay now. Then Naomi took the child, laid him in her lap, and cared for him, which, this is her grandchild. And the women living there said, "Naomi has a son." Of course, he's actually a grandson, but they named him Obed. Okay, so Naomi now, who left full and came back empty, is now full again. She has the grandson that will provide for her. But I know some of you are old enough to know who Paul Harvey was. And Paul Harvey would tell these stories, and then he would get to the last part, which was what? The rest of the story. The rest of the story. Here is the rest of the story. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So, why is this story important? Because this is the family of the great King David. This is the genealogy of the great King David. This is not just a random story about a family of Bethlehem. This is the story of how David's grandfather. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez being that child born of Judah and Tamar. Perez was the father of Herzon. Herzon was the father of Ram. Ram was the father of Amminadab. Amminadab was the father of Nahshon. Nahshon was the father of Salmon. Salmon was the father of Boaz. Boaz was the father of Obed. Obed was the father of Jesse. And Jesse, the father of David. And that is the rest of the story. And you say, why? Yeah, why? Because until you get to that point, you're like, well, why is this in the Bible? I mean, really, what does this story have to do with something? I mean, yeah, it's a kind of a little, romance story or whatever, but why is it in the Bible? It's in the Bible because it is the story of David's grandfather and how he came to be. That's what makes it, as they're telling the story, that's the thing, and that is how we got David. That's where he came from. So, the questions that this story kind of raises, though, is one of the things that the story kind of flies in the face of. Go back to Deuteronomy, for that's the end of the book, but there's kind of a mixed message about some things. If you go back to Deuteronomy for a minute, Deuteronomy 7. Go to Deuteronomy 7. And again, we're talking about some of the warnings that the people of Israel had about entering Canaan. Deuteronomy 7. And this is back, remember, we're back when we're still before they cross the Jordan, before they enter into the promised land. Deuteronomy 7. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you're entering to possess and drives out before you the many nations, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you. And when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you, and you have defeated them, and you must destroy them totally, make no treaty with them, show them no mercy, do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn against you, and will quickly destroy you. And then it goes on, you're supposed to basically get rid of them. So many, many places in the Old Testament it says, don't marry foreign women. And yet, that's what sickly and frail do. That's what Mahlon and Chilion do. They marry Moabite women. And the heroine of the story is not a Jew. She is a Moabite who then is brought into the people, the people of Israel. And so, some say, well, why is this book in the Bible? Well, it's because it's, where did David come from? But some say it was also a story that was meant to, in some ways, maybe soften that idea that all foreign women are horrible, evil, and to be stayed away from. I mean, here's a foreign woman, here's a Moabitess that actually ends up being, one of the great-grandmother of David, and, is the heroine of the story. And you think about this is part of the laws given to the early Israelites, but when Moses flees from Egypt, where does he go? He goes to Midian, right? And what does he do when he gets to Midian? He marries a Midianite woman, right? And that's Moses. And when the spies go into Jericho, remember there's a prostitute there? And remember, even though she's a Canaanite, God spares her, and she is included into then the people of Israel. So this idea of all foreign women are to be, stayed away from, I think maybe there's a little bit of leeway with that. I think there maybe is a little bit of, maybe that's not exactly always going to be a rule that you have to follow. When you look at Jesus' genealogy, look at Jesus' genealogy at the beginning of Matthew 1. And look at what women are actually mentioned in this genealogy. Because usually women are not mentioned in the genealogy. But Matthew 1, a record of the genealogy, Matthew 1:1, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David, the son of Abraham. Verse 3, in that genealogy, Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was who? Tamar. Tamar, who pretended to be a prostitute to trick her father-in-law into getting her pregnant. Then you keep going down and you get to Salmon, the mother of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Who is that? That's the prostitute. That's the prostitute we referenced earlier. And Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, who was a Moabitess, right? And then you get to David, the father of Solomon, whose mother was who? It doesn't mention her by name. Uriah's wife, whose name was Bathsheba. Those are the four women who are mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus, other than Mary, his mother. But you think about it, all four of those women have kind of a little bit of a, Tamar's story is a little off, and, Rahab is a prostitute, and Ruth is a Moabitess, and then Bathsheba is the mother of Solomon through an affair. The four women that are part of the genealogy, and it's only those four women are the only ones mentioned, other than Mary. I said his mother, Jesus' mom. But it's interesting that of all the women that could have been included in that, like it says Abraham was the father of Isaac. Who is not mentioned? Sarah. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Who's not mentioned? Rebecca. Women that you would think would be in the genealogy are not mentioned. It's the sort of scarlet letter women who are. You know what I mean by that? As in, the novel, The Scarlet Letter, the Hester, who had to wear the A for adultery. So it's interesting that that's how Matthew chooses to include in the genealogy. But the story of Ruth, I think, it's a really well-told story. About, but it's a story about these two women who have a very close bond and who care for each other and end up taking care of each other and end up going from destitution to, a pretty good place. And again, you think about, given the culture that women are often so powerless and treated as possessions. Stories like Esther and Ruth and Deborah are all kind of anomalies to that, of these sort of strong women who do pretty important things. So, That's Ruth. Next week, I'm going to talk about a guy who is not the brightest fellow, the sharpest knife in the drawer, and that's Samson. His story is also entertaining, but a little. He's not the maybe the hero that we wish he was. But we'll look at Samson's story. So, any questions, thoughts, reflections of any of that? Right. Oh, by the way, you get the woman with it. Yeah. Yeah. To the deal. Yeah. Right. And it's almost like he baits the guy and says, "Do you want to buy the land?" Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, and by the way, yeah. By the way, here's the catch. The land actually would not be yours because it would go to the son you would bear by her, and it would be considered not part of your inheritance, but part of his. Yeah. Yeah, I think it was he did that all in purpose. The way he presented the bargain, and oh, by the way, kind of part. I think he got the guy to go for it, and then threw in. But here's the other piece of that, and the other sandal dropped, and and the guy's maybe not. Maybe I won't do that. Yeah. So. Yeah, as I say, I think it's for 4 chapters. It's a pretty, and it's been expanded into romance novels and given a lot of backstory that people have created for it, and probably left out some of the parts that were, like what exactly did she do on that threshing floor? I mean, how did that actually play out? I think it's intentionally a little vague exactly what happened on the threshing floor. But anyway. Well, why don't we pray and get ready for next time? Lord, we thank you for women like Naomi and Ruth who trusted you, who came to know you. We thank you for people like Ruth who left a pagan religion and came to follow you. And there are people in our world today that are needing to leave something else that is controlling them, and they need to come to you. And Lord, in all things, we are thankful for who you are and what you do. And we ask you to bless us now. Amen.